By the time I learned my ex-husband had another family in another state, the divorce was already final. There were no pending signatures, no documents waiting for review, no unresolved accounts. Everything that could be closed had been closed. The house had been divided, the savings had been split, the retirement accounts had been calculated down to exact percentages. What I walked away with had already been agreed to. What he walked away with had already been transferred. There was nothing provisional about it. I wasn't in the middle of a dispute when I found out. I wasn't questioning my decisions. I wasn't searching for clarity or revisiting the marriage. I believed the process was finished. The truth did not arrive during the marriage. It did not arrive during mediation. It did not arrive when the lawyers were still involved. It arrived later. It arrived casually. It arrived in the middle of a conversation that wasn't supposed to mean anything. Someone mentioned a detail that didn't belong to my life. They said it without hesitation, without checking first. They spoke to me as if I already understood the context. I didn't interrupt them right away. I assumed I was missing something obvious. I assumed the problem was my memory, not the statement itself. So I let them continue. And as they did, it became clear that they were describing a situation that ran parallel to mine. Another home, another routine, another set of responsibilities. Not something new, something that had existed alongside my own life. I remember thinking, not emotionally, just practically, that this information would have mattered earlier. It would have mattered when we were dividing assets. It would have mattered when I was deciding what to keep and what to let go. It would have mattered when I was being asked to compromise. But those decisions had already been made. At that point, there was nothing left to negotiate, no leverage left to consider, no process left that could absorb new facts. The system had already done what it was designed to do. It finalized outcomes based on the information it was given. And I realized, very clearly, that I had been operating with incomplete information, not because I ignored something, not because I avoided questions, because there were questions I didn't know existed. This isn't a story about discovery in the moment. It's about understanding something only after it can no longer influence the result. By the time I knew what I had been sharing my marriage with, there was nothing left to reopen, only facts to place in order. And the understanding that some truths don't arrive when they're useful. They arrive when everything they could have changed is already settled. For context, my name is Rachel Morgan. I'm in my mid-40s. I was married to Daniel Morgan for 14 years. We lived in 3 states over the course of that time. We moved for work, we moved for timing, we moved when it made sense on paper. Daniel worked in operations management. His job was stable and transferable. Mine was administrative and remote by the later years. Our income was predictable, not identical, but consistent. We owned one primary residence at a time. Each purchase followed the same process: down payment, joint mortgage, shared responsibility. There were no properties held separately, no businesses outside the marriage, no accounts labeled as personal. We had joint checking, joint savings, retirement accounts funded proportionally through our employers, taxes were filed jointly every year, statements were mailed to the same address, nothing was redirected. Large expenses were discussed, smaller ones followed routine patterns. Travel was planned around work schedules. Absences were accounted for in advance. If something changed, it was usually logistical: a delayed flight, a rescheduled meeting, a longer week. There were no unexplained withdrawals, no missing documentation, no gaps that required follow-up. From an administrative standpoint, the marriage functioned as expected. Decisions were made using the information available at the time. Budgets were built around known obligations. Long-term planning assumed shared participation. There was nothing in our records that suggested duplication, nothing that implied resources were being divided elsewhere. Looking back, I understand how this part sounds. People expect irregularities to appear early, but at this stage there were none. Everything matched what it was supposed to match, and that is why nothing stood out. There were things I didn't know. At the time, I didn't categorize them as missing information. I categorized them as unnecessary detail. Daniel traveled for work. That was established early in our marriage. The destinations varied. The timing shifted. I usually knew when he was leaving and when he was expected back. I didn't always know where he was staying. That wasn't unusual within the context of his job. Hotels were booked through corporate systems. Schedules were adjusted based on availability. If I asked where he was going, I received an answer that made sense. A city, a region, a general explanation tied to work. What I didn't receive were details that required follow-up. There was no itinerary pinned to the fridge, no calendar entry that needed syncing. The absence of specifics didn't feel like an omission. It felt like efficiency. There were weeks when he was gone longer than expected. Those extensions were explained as delays, meetings that ran over, additional responsibilities added at the last minute. I didn't challenge those explanations, not because I was avoiding questions, but because nothing in our day-to-day operations required them. Our household continued to function on schedule. Bills were paid automatically, deposits arrived on time. If there had been disruption, I would have noticed it there first. Conversations followed a pattern. We discussed what needed to be discussed. If something was resolved, it wasn't reopened. There were topics that didn't come up again once they were addressed. Travel was one of them. We didn't debrief trips unless something went wrong. Most of the time, nothing did. Financial decisions were made in blocks. Large ones were reviewed together. Smaller ones were absorbed into the monthly total. I didn't audit our finances. I reviewed them. Statements aligned with expectations. Withdrawals matched known expenses. There were no duplicate charges that required explanation. When adjustments were made, they were framed as necessary. Taxes, insurance, cost of living changes after moves. Those explanations didn't raise questions because they were consistent with the data in front of me. There were moments of absence that I registered but didn't catalog. A call that came later than expected. A response that arrived the next morning instead of the same evening. These were not patterns at the time. They were isolated occurrences. I didn't assemble them into a narrative. I didn't assign meaning to them. There was nothing I believed I needed to know beyond what affected our shared obligations. Our responsibilities were met. Our records were complete. From a practical standpoint, there was no indication that information was being withheld. Looking back, I understand why people assume this is where questions should have started. But at the time, nothing was unresolved. Everything that mattered appeared accounted for. And because of that, nothing felt incomplete. Our routines stayed intact. Weekdays followed a set order. Mornings began at the same time. Evenings ended the same way. Meals were planned around availability. Groceries were purchased once a week. Nothing unusual appeared on receipts. When Daniel was home, his schedule matched what I expected it to match. When he was away, the household adjusted without strain. There was no period where I felt I was carrying more responsibility than agreed upon. Utilities remained consistent. Usage didn't fluctuate in a way that suggested additional demands. Holidays were handled efficiently. Travel was planned in advance. If work interfered, it was accounted for early. We did not overlap commitments that required explanation. There were no sudden cancellations that needed justification. Financial records reinforced this sense of order. Income deposits arrived on schedule. Contributions to retirement accounts remained unchanged. Employer statements matched payroll summaries. Health insurance covered the same individuals year after year. Nothing new appeared. Nothing disappeared. When we moved states, the process followed a standard sequence. Notice given, lease or sale finalized, new address registered, mail was forwarded correctly, documents arrived where they were supposed to. There were no gaps in communication with banks or employers, no accounts flagged, no inquiries that required explanation. From the outside and from within, the structure held. This mattered later, though I didn't know it would at the time. It meant there was nothing to question during ordinary review, nothing to challenge during routine planning. Even in hindsight, it's difficult to isolate a moment that would have justified suspicion. If a system continues to meet its obligations, it doesn't draw attention to itself. That was the case here. The marriage functioned, the household operated within known parameters. When discussions occurred, they stayed within those boundaries. We talked about future expenses, adjustments for retirement timelines, possibilities for relocation if work required it again. Those conversations assumed one set of variables. At no point did I believe additional variables existed, and because nothing in our routine contradicted that assumption, it remained unchallenged. Consistency has a way of discouraging review. If nothing appears out of place, there is no reason to re-examine the structure itself. At this stage, everything still fit. The decision to divorce didn't come from one big moment. It happened after a series of conversations that felt practical. We talked about where we were headed, about what made sense going forward. There wasn't a fight that ended it. There wasn't a dramatic turning point. Once we agreed it was over, the rest moved faster than I expected. We chose mediation instead of going to court. It seemed simpler, less expensive. The mediator explained how things would work. We'd list what we owned. We'd confirm balances. We'd split everything according to standard rules. That's what we did. We went through the accounts one by one: checking, savings, retirement. The house was appraised, the mortgage balance was confirmed, the equity was divided. Nothing came up that surprised me. Daniel answered the questions he was asked. His answers matched the paperwork. When compromises were suggested, I considered them carefully. Some felt easy to agree to, others took a little more discussion. I wasn't rushing, but I wasn't pushing back either. I believed I understood what we were dividing. There were no requests for additional information beyond finances. No one asked about anything outside the marriage itself. The process assumed everything on the table was everything that existed. At the time, that assumption felt reasonable. By the final meeting, most of what was left was procedural: dates, deadlines, signatures. When the agreement was ready, I read it carefully. I checked the numbers. I recognized every account listed. Nothing stood out to be missing. From my perspective, it felt settled. It felt finished. And because of that, I treated it that way. Once we reached agreement, everything shifted into paperwork mode. That's really how it felt. Like the decision part was already over, and now it was just execution. The documents came in a packet. I didn't skim them. I sat down and read through every section. I checked names, I checked balances, I checked dates and account numbers. I compared them to statements I already had saved. Everything matched. There wasn't a moment where I stopped and thought something looked off. When it came time to sign, I didn't feel rushed. No one pressured me. I signed because I believed the work had already been done. To me, the signature wasn't a gamble. It felt like the last step in a process that had already settled itself. After that, things started to change in small, visible ways. The house paperwork updated. The account access shifted. Notifications came in from banks confirming transfers. I watched balances adjust in real time. I knew exactly which portion was mine and which portion wasn't anymore. There was no confusion about where anything went. When something moved out of my account, I understood why it moved. When something stayed, it stayed because that's what we had agreed to. I kept copies of everything, digital and paper. I wasn't trying to protect myself from anything specific. I just wanted records in case I ever needed them. Once the final filing was confirmed, that was the end of contact about the divorce itself. No follow-ups, no revisions, no new disclosures. The lawyers closed their files. The mediator moved on. Life adjusted around the new structure. Bills came to me alone instead of jointly. I updated automatic payments. I changed beneficiaries where necessary. All of that felt normal. People sometimes assume this stage is chaotic. For me, it wasn't. It was quiet. It was orderly. I wasn't waiting for another shoe to drop. I wasn't expecting a delayed conversation. I believed that anything important would have surfaced during the process. That's what the process is supposed to do. It gathers information, it verifies it, it finalizes decisions based on what's presented. And as far as I knew at the time, everything that mattered had already been presented. No one told me anything outright. No one hinted. No one acted like there was something I was supposed to ask about. If there had been even a small signal earlier, I would have remembered it later. But there wasn't. I didn't hear about it during the marriage. I didn't hear about it while the divorce was happening. It came up afterward, when I thought everything connected to that part of my life was already settled. I was having a normal conversation with someone who knew Daniel through work. We weren't talking about personal matters. We weren't revisiting the divorce. It was casual, the kind of conversation you don't replay later because nothing about it feels important at the time. At some point, they mentioned a place Daniel spent time. They didn't frame it as a business trip. They didn't explain it. It was said in passing, the same way someone would mention a regular part of their routine. I remember pausing for a second, not because I felt alarmed, but because the detail didn't line up with what I knew. I assumed I was missing context, so I asked a basic question, not confrontational, just enough to understand what they meant. They answered right away. There was no hesitation in their voice, no correction, no sense that they were sharing something sensitive. That's when it became clear they thought I already had this information. They kept talking, filling in small details without realizing what they were doing. The way they spoke made it obvious this wasn't new. They referenced routines, how often he was there, how it fit into his schedule. At that point, I stopped trying to make it fit into what I already knew. I asked them directly to clarify what they meant. That's when they stopped and looked at me differently. They asked if I was serious, if I really didn't know. When I said I didn't, the conversation shifted. They didn't start explaining. They didn't offer details. They just said they assumed I was aware. That sentence stayed with me, not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied. It meant this information had existed outside of me for some time. It meant other people had context I didn't. I didn't ask them to continue. I didn't need to hear more in that moment. By then, the outline was already forming. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about overlap or confusion. There was another household in another state, and it had been part of his life while I believed I was sharing all of it. I didn't feel anger right away. What I felt first was disoriented. It was the kind of feeling you get when you stand up too fast and the room doesn't catch up with you. I remember sitting down after that conversation ended because I suddenly didn't trust my balance. Not in a dramatic way, just enough that I noticed it. My head felt light, my thoughts felt slightly delayed, like they were arriving a second too late. I kept replaying the same few sentences, trying to make them fit into what I already knew. They didn't. It wasn't shock so much as misalignment, like being handed instructions for something you didn't realize you were already doing wrong. I remember thinking I needed to sit still for a moment before doing anything else. I didn't call anyone, I didn't confront anyone. I just stayed where I was and tried to understand what my body was reacting to before my mind could explain it. Over the next few days, that feeling came and went. Sometimes I'd be fine, doing something ordinary, and then it would return. A brief wave of unsteadiness. A moment where I had to pause and remind myself where I was. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because the timeline in my head kept shifting. Each new detail changed how I understood the ones before it. Someone mentioned a date. That date overlapped with a year I remembered clearly. I felt that same lightheaded sensation again. Not panic, just the sense that my internal map was being redrawn faster than I could follow. I still didn't know everything. I didn't know how long it had been going on. I didn't know who else was involved. But my body seemed to understand before I fully did that this wasn't a small adjustment. This wasn't one missing detail. It was a parallel structure I hadn't been aware of. I started noticing how often I had to stop and recenter myself during normal tasks. Standing at the sink, walking into a room and forgetting why I went there. It wasn't constant. It came in short intervals, usually right after I realized another piece of time no longer meant what I thought it did. I wasn't searching for answers yet. I was still trying to stay oriented inside my own life. Because even without knowing the full story, I could feel that something fundamental had shifted. Not emotionally, structurally. After the initial confusion settled a little, I started noticing patterns. Not because I went looking for them, but because once you know something exists, you can't unknow it. Dates began to matter more than they had before. Someone mentioned a time frame. It overlapped with a year I remembered clearly. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't something brief. My body reacted before my thoughts did again. I felt that same unsteady sensation, like I needed to pause what I was doing and ground myself. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding onto the counter longer than necessary, just letting the idea settle. Once I understood the overlap, other things shifted with it. Trips I remembered planning around suddenly had a second explanation. Weeks I thought were fully accounted for now had open space I hadn't noticed before. I didn't feel upset in the way people usually expect. What I felt was recalibration, like the timeline in my head was being stretched and relabeled at the same time. I began mentally placing markers. This trip happened then, that move happened after, this conversation happened while something else was already in place. The more I did that, the clearer it became that this second household wasn't an interruption. It fit. It ran alongside my life with him without causing friction. That's what made it harder to process. Nothing had ever collided. There were no scheduling conflicts that reached me, no financial emergencies that forced questions. Everything had been kept separate enough to function on its own. At some points, I realized I was no longer asking if this was real. I was asking how long. And once that question formed, it didn't go away. I still didn't know who else was involved. I didn't know what role I played in the story that existed outside of me. But the scale of it was becoming harder to minimize. This wasn't one missing conversation. It was years of decisions made with information I didn't have. I noticed how often I had to stop what I was doing just to sit with that realization. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my sense of continuity kept breaking and resetting. Life didn't feel unreal. It felt rearranged. And the more clearly I could see the outline of what had been happening, the more I understood that this wasn't something I could unsee or reduce. It was bigger than a single discovery. It was a structure that had existed quietly, and I was only now becoming aware of its full size. Once I accepted that this other life had existed for a long time, a different question started to surface. It wasn't the question people usually jump to. I wasn't focused on why he did it yet. I kept wondering who else had known. Not in an accusatory way, just in a practical one. I started replaying conversations from the past, but not looking for hidden meanings. I was listening for assumptions. Comments that had seemed neutral at the time now landed differently. Someone once asked how often I traveled with him. I'd answered honestly, without thinking much about it. Another person had mentioned how well he managed his schedule. I'd taken that at face value. At the time, none of it stood out. Now I could hear the gaps around those comments. I didn't suddenly believe everyone knew everything. What I began to understand was that people often know parts. One person knows a location, another knows a pattern, someone else knows a routine. Those pieces don't always come together unless someone is standing in the middle of them. I wasn't, and because I wasn't, no one stopped to check what I had been told. There were people who interacted with both versions of his life, but not at the same time. To them, it didn't feel like secrecy, it felt like compartmentalization. I don't remember anyone looking uncomfortable around me. No one avoided eye contact. There was no moment where I felt deliberately excluded. That was part of what made it harder to process. It meant this wasn't sustained by silence alone. It was sustained by assumptions. People assumed I knew what applied to me. People assumed the parts they saw were the only relevant ones. I also realized how easy it is for a system like that to exist without anyone feeling responsible for it. No single person had the whole picture, and because of that, no single person felt like they were withholding anything. Understanding that didn't make it easier, it just made it clearer. I wasn't kept in the dark by one decisive moment. I was kept there by a series of small, ordinary assumptions that never intersected. For a while, I kept thinking the loss was about the marriage itself. That's the easiest way to explain it, and it's the explanation people expect. But the more time passed, the more I realized that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me were the decisions I had made based on information that wasn't complete. I kept going back to specific moments, times when I had agreed to something because it felt reasonable, times when I had let something go because it didn't seem worth holding on to. At the time, those choices felt balanced. Looking back, I could see they were balanced only within the version of reality I was given. I thought about the mediation sessions, about the compromises I agreed to. I didn't agree to them because I felt pressured. I agreed because I believed I understood the scope of what we were dividing. That belief mattered. It shaped how I prioritized things. There were assets I chose not to contest because I thought they carried equal weight elsewhere. There were timelines I accepted because I believed we were closing one shared chapter. Once I understood there had been another structure in place at the same time, those decisions felt different. Not wrong in the moment, just informed by something that wasn't accurate. I realized the loss wasn't only financial. It was the loss of agency over choices I can't revisit. I can't renegotiate them. I can't reframe them. The outcomes are already fixed. I also noticed how often people tried to reassure me by focusing on what I still had. And I understand why they did that, but that wasn't the point I was stuck on. What I kept circling back to was how different my decisions might have been if the full picture had been available at the time. Not out of anger, out of practicality, because choices only make sense in the context they're made in, and mine were made in a context that didn't actually exist in full. For a while, I didn't say anything to Daniel. Not because I was trying to plan a confrontation, but because I needed to be sure of what I was asking him about. Once you say something like that out loud, you can't take it back. When I finally reached out, I kept it simple. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't list what I knew. I asked him one question. I asked him if there had been another household during our marriage. There was a pause before he answered. Not a long one, just long enough that I noticed it. When he spoke, his response wasn't denial. He didn't ask what I was talking about. He asked how much I knew. That told me more than a direct answer would have. I told him what I knew, which at that point wasn't much. Another state, another place he stayed regularly. I didn't fill in the rest. I waited. He confirmed it without elaborating. He didn't frame it as a confession. He spoke the way someone does when they believe the conversation is overdue. He said it had been complicated. He said it hadn't felt manageable to explain. I asked him how long it had been going on. He answered that question directly. The length of time mattered more to me than any explanation he could have given. When he told me, I had to sit down. Not because I felt overwhelmed, but because the number placed events in years I remembered clearly, years where I could picture where we lived, where I was working, what decisions we were making together. I asked him why I hadn't been told during the divorce. He said it didn't seem relevant anymore. That was the moment I realized we were never going to agree on what mattered. I told him it would have changed how I negotiated. He didn't argue with that. He also didn't offer to correct anything. The agreement was already final. There was nothing to revise. The conversation didn't escalate. There was no shouting, no apology that altered anything. It ended the way most of our conversations toward the end had ended, calmly and incomplete. After that conversation, the clarity didn't bring relief. What it brought was a feeling I didn't recognize right away. It took time to understand that what I was feeling wasn't just disappointment or anger, it was betrayal. Not only because there had been another family, but because I had been standing in a version of reality that wasn't real, and I had been making permanent decisions inside it. I trusted that when we sat across from each other during mediation, we were dividing a shared life honestly. I trusted that silence meant there was nothing left to disclose. Realizing that trust had been misplaced was harder than the divorce itself. I kept thinking about how calm I had been during the process, how careful, how willing to compromise. I believed that cooperation meant fairness. Now I understand that cooperation only works when both people are working with the same truth. What hurt most wasn't losing half of everything. It was realizing that I had offered good faith to someone who was holding back the most important part of the story. I felt foolish in ways I didn't expect, not because I ignored signs, but because I trusted the structure I was standing in. That trust didn't disappear when the marriage ended. It disappeared when I realized it had never been mutual. Even now, what stays with me isn't the other family. It's the feeling of having been honest in a process where honesty wasn't shared, and knowing that the part of myself that believed in fairness was the part that ended up costing me the most. If you've been through something similar, or if you think you would have handled this differently, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments how you see it. And if stories like this matter to you, like the video and subscribe in order to get updates of our stories that will drive you to the edge of your seats.